just let me start with a huge thank you for taking the time and the investment. On a quick side note, Adecco is where I started my career 30 some years ago, was with the Adecco organization as well as the AOC and Agilon organization, and worked for really unbelievable people those 6 years, and was given just an afforded amazing opportunity. And then have been here in Bozeman in the Valley for the last 16. Al and I kicked the tires on a couple of ideas, and I loved where he landed and brought us in terms of that CEOs really are no longer leading and managing companies, and wanted to talk and open up the conversation about what's the shift there, Alan? What are you seeing, and what can we extrapolate as Montana companies to grow our team's leadership in the state, as well as those that are coming into our state? And let's start there, and then we'll talk on some other trends we discussed.
Okay, Julie, happy to. I didn't know that you were at Adecco previously. Maybe we overlapped. When I was there, Klaus Yakov was CEO, and Ray Rowe was CEO of Adecco North America. And I think Neil Leibowitz was running Agilon at the time. And of course,
so I worked for all of them.
Okay.
I was there during the Adecco merger.
Okay, great. Yeah. So Jean-Philippe Destizé, probably from Echo. And Steve Harrison was at the time still running Lehigh Harrison. So it was a very cool company at the time, really cool.
It was, I loved it. It was a great time in my life.
And a pretty great story apropos to what we're talking about, considering Klaus Yakov had the vision to start a staffing business outside the United States that grew to be twice the size of Manpower, and Manpower is the one we know. And then he executed a terrific merger with another founder and created Adecco. Anyway, CEOs, again, apropos to the topic, the thing I like to say is that CEOs don't run companies anymore. Teams do. And, we can get into this for half an hour and no other questions. So we'll try not to get too deep. But the point is that we are at a crossroads, because most CEOs still think they do run the company. And the faster that they realize that their job, because of the state of play today in running any organization, calls for team resources. No CEO today can really do the things that need to be done across the board as they did for decades in the past as the true sort of, let's call it, hierarchical leader. And there's a whole bunch of reasons. I like to say in big buckets, it's because of pace. The speed of business today compared to a decade or two ago, let alone 50 years ago, is exponentially faster. Complexity is everywhere. And then globalization. Small companies can compete on a global arena. So with that, if you don't have a team as a CEO that's really a team, then you're trying to do work that no human being has the capacity to do alone. So that's my point when I say CEOs don't run companies anymore. It gets people's attention. And the reality is that it is all about the team. Now, I will tell you that the team sometimes is the challenge as well. And that means that we use the word team, but more often than not, I encounter a company that has a committee at best, or a working group that has a title of team, but when you talk about what they think about each day, they're sadly thinking too much only about their own lanes. And therefore, we do have a disconnect between them being enterprise leaders, which every CEO is, but if the CEO is the only enterprise thinker, then it's a lonely place. So anyway, continue, but that's the summary of what we mean when we say that CEOs don't run companies anymore, teams do.
So let's touch on that. So let's shift to that, because you have a really nice mix in this group today. I recognize a lot of you. Hello. You have a really nice mix in this group today of CEOs, founder, owner, operators, and leaders. Speak to the enterprise leadership mentality, and from if with the whole group, and that group specifically extrapolated one golden nugget from you today, what would you want them to take in and move into action going forward?
Okay, super. I would say real cohesiveness and real unity of vision and tactics. So I'll take it back to when I was a founder. I often use this explanation to say that when I was an early leader, and I should have known better because of my background in the Army, but I tell people I was absolutely the best paperclip buyer in my company. And what I mean by that is, how important is it, the decision around which paper clips to buy? It's not really important in the context of the company. So what it really means is I was into too much. Why was I worried about whether we were buying paper clips effectively? It's silly. Now, obviously, it's a bit of an exaggeration, but my point is that if you are, as the CEO, too much into the weeds, then obviously with you in the weeds, people tend to lay back because you're there, you're the CEO, and if you're going to do it, they don't need to. And oh, by the way, if you're going to do it, you're in their way because they ought to be doing it. And so it creates a level of either dysfunctionality at its worst or suboptimal functionality as a leadership team. So when I say unity of vision, well, you can't think for the enterprise if you don't have uniformity around where the enterprise is headed. So that's really important. So what do CEOs need to do? If they're not running the company, what are they doing? Their number one job is to optimize the team effectiveness. If they optimize the team effectiveness, the company runs itself through those other leaders. So that's really the big job of the CEO. And so with that, there's all kinds of things the CEO needs to be doing. But to answer the question around what are the takeaways, if you asked every member of the leadership team where the company was headed, is the answer almost word for word the same? That's the measure. If the answer is indeed that, you've accomplished something. And then, of course, once that happens, it needs to cascade down the organization. So if you ask people 3 levels below, are they also saying pretty much the same thing? If that's not the case, then you are not basically harnessing the full power of a unified organization. So that means people are going to make decisions that go to how we allocate resources, that go to, how we talk to customers, that are not the same. And as a result, it diminishes the power of the tip of the spear. So if it's blunt instrument, it's not as powerful as if it's a spear, right? So that's really important. That makes sense?
Absolutely. Let's unpackage that one step further for all of the CEOs, presidents, owners here today, and who are going to watch it down the road. So if they are in that position where they are still essentially in the way and they are kind of what's clogging, the pipes, your point, which is spot on, which is get out of the way and let your people lead, is necessary and really hard, right? So for people that are needing to make a radical shift from working in their business to on their business, where do they start? And more importantly, where are they mentored, guided, and held accountable beyond themselves?
Okay, well, bunch of stuff there. Let me try to get it right. There's a paper I did out there floating around the web. It's about what new leaders need to do, especially CEOs. And it's also subtitled something about making tough calls. So it's one thing to say, don't micromanage, because that's really what I'm saying. It's one thing to say, create enterprise leaders who don't just think about their silos. But on the other hand, I'll go back to my time as the founder, and I always say that in the beginning of the company, which was bootstrapped, I hired what I could afford, not what I needed. Okay, I hired what I could afford, not what I needed, which meant that for a period of time, I actually had to do more because it was silly to think that I was going to be able to delegate to less experienced people who are coming up the curve that fit the price, the compensation model that I could afford. And so partially I had to be a bridge, but you've got to get out of that and ultimately make the hiring decisions, the tough decisions around who's going to be with you for the longer part of the journey. I always say that people think companies grow up and to the right if they're growing, and it kind of looks like this line. And that may be true if you look at their numbers of revenue. They kind of going to go up to the right. But when you're talking about operating a company, companies grow in stair steps. They go up, and then they go over for a while. They go up, and they go over for a while. And when you hit that riser, there's three things you have to get right: people, capital, and product. If you get those three right, you get to that next flat area where you can run for a while. And then you bump into that riser again: people, capital, product, and again. Okay. Well, what that means is I hit that riser. Maybe I have people who got me here that aren't going to get me there. And so I'm going to need to, during that flat period, develop them. And sadly, at the riser point, if they're not coming up with us, then they're not gonna come up. And so we need to replace them, and it's hard, but it's a reality. And by the way, there's a time when you look in the mirror and you realize you're the founder, but you're not the CEO for the next level. And so
100%.
brilliant founders know when to fire themselves and bring in the professional management that will continue the journey. That makes sense?
100%. So let's then shift over to the riser conversation, because as Philip and I were discussing, and Jenny and I, and then of course yourself last week, in terms of where Montana is as a economy, as a business incubator, right? So I'm originally from Colorado and spent the early years of, spent all of my formative years, 20s and 30s in Denver and Boulder, which now is an interesting playbook, being in Montana, the last 16 years and seeing that roadmap of where we are going as an economy. When I grew up in Denver, I-25 to Fort Collins, you could get to 120th Avenue and then go a full 60 miles with nothing but ag. It was all fields. And the same thing from Castle, from the tech center to Castle Rock was just fields. It was all ag. And now that that 90-mile corridor from Castle Rock to Fort Collins is absolutely completely filled in. And I-90 is going to look incredibly similar for our state, where these small communities start to fill in, and you can see what's coming, and you can't stop that train. That train has left the station. But Montana, if we are, let's call it 15, 20 years behind Colorado, we are probably 50 years behind New York City. But history always teaches us so much about what to not replicate, not what to redo, and time will escalate, technology will shorten the curve, right? So let's say we shrink that down to 5 or 10 years. What would you say to us as Montanans who are growing and throttling, scaling businesses? What would you say to us to absolutely make certain we do? And then what would you say to us, stay away from it, avoid it, let me save you from yourself?
Yeah, so talent and leadership, I'm very comfortable with that topic. Economic development strategy, not so much. So there are definitely better people in the world to answer a lot of those questions, but you bring up brilliant, very important observations. And so let me try to do it with a little bit of a business builder lens and maybe a little bit of a talent lens. I think what you described basically is a geographic location called Montana, right? That is in a period of transformation.
Mhm.
And that transformation probably looks like creating a venue for businesses that are different than the businesses that have been in that real estate for the last 100 years. And so that those businesses require different resources. So in my view, you look at the ecosystem that is needed to support growing businesses that are different and probably tech-centric in most cases. And so obviously that means, you need the right academic institutions to provide the raw material to go into these companies, and the less than raw material out of graduate schools and postgraduate schools. And so you need them within striking distance geographically, or you need to know how to put the Montana brand at places like MIT and others, right? And you could list 25 that would probably be the right 25, where you'd like graduates of those places to be thinking about finding a job at a Montana company, right? And the companies have to do this too. But as a 501c3 promoting Montana, then you got to probably figure that out. So what else does the ecosystem call for? Obviously it calls for housing, because people have to have a place to live that they can afford. And people in growth companies may not have as much cash flow as companies that are large and paying big salaries and big bonuses and less equity. So long and short of it is, we don't need to go through every component, but you have to say that that Montana isn't a state. Montana is a venue, and that venue needs to support the growth of companies of various sizes. And so what do companies need to grow? And then make sure those are accessible either by importing or by having it organic to that X hundreds or thousands of square miles or acres that we call Montana.
Yep. So I love the word venue. Let's talk quickly about our fabulous universities and what they are bringing to the scene. I'm going to relate it back to the Boulder and Denver conversation really quick, where when Denver did their big dig on I-25 and the new airport and the new ballparks, and then we had a storm of telecom technology, VCP money just absolutely poured into the state. We went through a very real period where we imported talent, where these growth businesses that were bringing next level technology ideas and infrastructure into our city and state, we were literally transporting in talent from other states. And you saw that, of course, for a period here in Montana. But what MSU, U of N, Montana Tech, and others are doing so beautifully, really, really hitting it out of the park in making our educational institutions next level. Whereas Denver and Boulder may have had to import for decades, right? Montana is going to shrink that fast. It's still going to be a combination, right? And it should be in every city where you're bringing in new ideas, you're bringing in different experience, different stories, where it can, grow the economic, the emotional, and the scalability of all of that for those that are invested and involved. But I actually think we are solving the education component exceedingly well for, especially a town that's a land grant school, right? They are really knocking it out of the park there. And what I've seen come out of MSU, U of M, Montana Tech is really on point. And I think people are making tremendous hires when they're hiring from our local institutions. Now let's talk about the housing challenge. And this is where you and Jenny and I were talking about that, Now, age-old dialogue on virtual or hybrid or remote, and that's kind of been talked to death. But for our state, it's a really lively conversation because Montana was so affordable. And Bozeman was affordable. And now it is exceedingly cost prohibitive, especially when we're talking about that talent game, right? Like, for the executives and ownership team, housing is, they're not pinched, right? But bringing in that next generation, especially those 20 somethings that are their future leaders, that are the idea generators and are boots on the ground. Housing is something we are going to be challenged with for the next decade, easily, for that scope, right? Where does the dialogue take us on virtual, hybrid, some sort of blend and flexibility to solve part of that problem? You and I are not going to solve the housing crisis in Bozeman today, right? But I'm fascinated about how the housing crisis and what we've learned from some sort of hybrid model, to whether you do it a half day a week or you allow people to do it full time, and whatever that mix looks like. I'm more interested in the debate as to how it helps solve housing than how we get people to return into an office or make everybody technology and no interaction forever. There's a sweet spot, TBD, and it's very geographically, it changes with geography, with companies, with trends. Certainly leadership drives that. Where do the two intersect to solve more problems?
Well, they intersect as to whether you need to be an importer of talent or not. So if people could afford at all levels to live in Bozeman and therefore not create a talent shortage at a certain level, you don't have a problem. But I'm assuming you do, based on the way you're describing it. So it's pretty simple. You have to figure out how you can supplement through remote workers who live in another place that they currently live in and can afford, but have them basically be part of your company. Not physically present, but they're W-2 employees, probably, although there's some other ways to do it through third parties that you can hire. Let's call it gig workers, right? But the remote work we typically refer to today is not gig workers. It's people that we would typically in the old world have had on W-2 and have had in our building, right? So then it begs the question of this competitive reasoning around your company's brand, right? So if you're going to be in Montana and in order to scale, state is not going to solve your problem fast enough around housing.
That's correct.
And you aren't going to pay 2x what the job is worth so people could afford housing. Your only option is to have remote workers. Okay, well, the only way you're going to get remote workers, because guess what? The labor market's very simple. The company is the consumer of talent, and the talent is the seller. So the bottom line is, seller basically is in a position to choose the best market, right, for them. I think I just got that backwards. I'm sorry. The seller is the employer and the consumer is the employee, right? So the employee gets to decide where they want to buy, and that's based on price. So at the end of the day, either you pay a outrageously high salary that you can't afford, and you'll get whoever you want, but it won't help your growth of your company because you'll be challenged in other ways, or you have to have an employer brand, because if I'm working remote and I'm going to have a lot more choices because I can work for any company anywhere in the world pretty much as a remote worker. So now I have to choose to work for your company in Montana. So employer value proposition, employer brand, the work you're doing, the culture of your company, all of those things are what you're going to have to focus on as a leader, because you're going to hire remote workers who have infinitely more options than people who have to choose a job in a geographic location where they live, right?
So one final question for me, and then we're going to open up to the audience. So now we've talked, about how we got to where we are. Put us on a trend setter conversation. You and I have been in this business a long time, right? So we could put our probably 4 or 5 decades combined, into 100 years of experience. And we know that there's always a real talent trend that shows up that is not a monetize where I'll use the example, we went through trends where the ping pong tables and the beer Friday cart, and that was really the currency of getting your hooks into top talent. We went through trends where it was title, right? People were so title motivated that you could swap out some flexibility or even some comp for the emotional compensation of title. Now we've seen the trend of hybrid or fully virtual, and that became the compensation more so than title, or certainly more so than being in the office with the bing bags and beer Friday. What's the next trend?
Purpose and culture. People want
And
to
how do
work
you win the talent game? How do you really win the talent game with that being the reason people choose where and how they go to work?
Goes to what I was talking about in terms of the employer value proposition. So as you gave examples years ago, the sexy things in the employer value proposition is we're going to have ping pong tables and you don't have to wear a suit. And oh, by the way, we might even give you a BMW, depending upon whether it was pre-2001 or not. Now it's people want to work for a company where there's some form of purpose, if at all possible. So tie what you're doing to making the world a better place. That's really valuable. If you're doing something that can make the world a better place, that's going to attract talent. That is one of those hooks, if you will. When I talk about culture, people want to be appreciated more than ever before. This is not a cohort of employees from Generation X down in terms of age that tolerates hierarchical, demanding leadership. They want to understand why you want them to do it and what's in it for them, as opposed to saying, I know I just have to pay my dues and suck it up, which our generation went through. And it worked for us and it doesn't work for them. And as a leader, you have to be aware of that and give them what you want, because they are the consumer and they get to vote with their feet. You can't make them work for your company. You can't. You can't make them work for your company. They get to choose. So as a result, you better be attractive to them. Culture is key. So I ascribe to my partners, my partner's book on leadership, Kevin Cashman, one of the most brilliant leadership consultants in the world. Kevin wrote the book Leadership from the Inside Out. It's the only leadership book anybody ever needs to read. And it's in its 11th edition for a reason. He only had to write it once, 20 years ago. And he was on to something that now the rest of the world has grown into, and it's the notion of authentic leadership. People follow people who are authentic. They don't follow people who are phonies. Phonies get found out, sometimes later rather than sooner, but eventually they do. And in order to be an incredible leader, a genuine, authentic leader, you first have to go through a very painful thing. Very painful. Most people haven't done it. Those that have rationalized it away. But that painful thing is called gaining self-awareness. Self-awareness to me is a code word for all the things that are wrong with you as a leader, that you have to finally swallow and accept. Dear friend of mine went on to become, in the last decade, the CEO of one of the top 50 companies in the world. And he went through Cashman's program and he learned what he needed to work on in order to get better. And he said, if I had not done that program when I was 42 years old and a president of a division, we wouldn't be sitting in my office right now where I'm the CEO of one of the 50 biggest companies in the world, because what I had to do after that period of development under the program was called the Executive Leader Institute. I had to accept what I learned about myself, which was painful, and I had to either rationalize it away or work on it. He said, I chose to work on it. I only got half of it fixed. The other half was me, and it wasn't fixable, but it was enough for me to eventually, 14 years later, become the CEO of this company. So, that's what I would leave you with. And that is, leadership is everything. It's an awesome responsibility. If you do it poorly, each day you're hurting somebody's daughter, son, husband, wife, partner, nephew, cousin, uncle. And these people have lives, and they go home and they take their work with them. And so leadership is an awesome responsibility, and it's not your old school approach to leading.
Alan, boy, leadership is an awesome responsibility. You are awesome. You are awesome. That's a perfect way to let's get this group involved and meet on mic. I'm gonna rewatch this 3 times this week. Thank you, Mike.
Yes, thank you. Unmute your microphones. Let's give them a round of applause. Wise words for us. Philip, yeah, your hand's raised.
Yes. Oh, I've got, that was absolutely terrific. Thank you, both of you. Alan, just so many, piles of wisdom in there, really. And so many of the different things you said resonated with me, especially your focus on leadership. I share your enthusiasm. I have lots of questions, but I'll just throw out one right now, very pragmatic for our founders, CEOs. You mentioned, at some point as a CEO, you need to be self-aware and fire yourself and get some, because there are different leaders who may be more appropriate for different phases of a company. And I've been through that. I've been on several boards where the founder CEO has stepped down, and we've gone out and hired a CEO who was right for that next chapter. And I did it to myself in my last startup. After running it for the first 4, getting it off the ground, running it for the first 4 years, went out, hired more of a scale CEO to take it in the next chapter. So totally agree with that. Are there, but that's self-awareness for a CEO to sit there and say, okay, I need to make this change. That's really hard, and it's hard for them to know. Do you have any advice for earlier stage company CEOs on how they should be thinking about when to know it's the right time for them to move on, and how to plan for bringing their successor in?
Yeah, I can tell you, that's a great question, because it's hard to see the forest from the trees when you're the CEO and the founder, and there's tremendous emotion. Anybody that's founded a company, we've all heard the analogy, it's like a child. It's like your kid. And that's not too much of an exaggeration. There's a couple things. First of all, your employees know when it's time for you to go. They just won't tell you. So have some type of really good formal or informal feedback loop that you develop, so that you're getting input from the people that work with you in your company around where you're getting in the way, how you're holding them back, how you're frustrating them, what they need that they can't get from you, and hope like hell that they're actually courageous enough and feel safe enough to actually tell you in ways that, they're comfortable with. It's not easy to do. It's a little bit of a utopic way to think, but if you're approachable, people will, and they feel ownership in the company. And by the way, let's talk about whether and how much ownership everybody ought to have in a growth company, because I believe everybody ought to be an owner, from the person at the reception desk to the founder. But anyway, so yeah, you gotta get other people to tell you things that you probably aren't going to want to hear, or maybe you are going to want to hear because you believe in this approach. The other is you need what I call a kitchen cabinet, and that's people outside the company that are willing to be available for you as a sounding board, and that maybe even have an insight into what you're doing, like perhaps a coach or two. And by the way, there are probably way too many not good coaches that call themselves coaches. That's another conversation. Coaches, the right coaches work is priceless. The wrong coaches is devastatingly expensive. So you're going to need to get that from others, but most of us are also smart enough to know if we really think objectively and observe what's happening when we are less than effective and when we're, let's say, outgunned. Doesn't mean we're not the founder anymore. It just means we're probably not ready to take the company to the next level.
There was a question on here.
Excellent. I know we've got some hands raised here, so I'll go ahead and turn it over to who had their hands raised. So you'll have to forgive me. I'm pulling up the chat right here, but I know Greg had a
Yeah, Greg has
question.
a
Do you
question.
mind going, Greg?
Oh, yeah, sure. Thanks. And thanks, Julie and Alan, for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Alan, as a founder CEO, recruiting talent is so hard, especially when you don't have the resources to hire a Korn Ferry. I'm kind of curious, looking out 5 to 10 years, what does the future of recruiting look like? And how will technology help or hurt us as early stage founders in doing so?
I think that the ability to identify talent continually improves. So LinkedIn is the age-old example, right? Before LinkedIn, talent identification was very manual, very difficult, very expensive, labor intensive. With LinkedIn, now identifying talent is painfully simple. Acquiring that talent once you've identified it is still difficult, but at least you can find dozens of people that fit your profiles for roles you're looking to fill by parsing through those screens. Now, as I said, making the outreach and getting those people and ultimately hiring them, that's still not much easier than it ever was, even though we're trying to create trickle marketing and bots and other ways to knock on people's doors through email and get them to, it's still very arcane and very inefficient. That's why, thankfully, our industry still exists. So in the future, I think that's where the improvement will come. But I don't, and by the way, I wouldn't have said this 10 years ago. I would have said recruiters will be obsolete in 10 years. Because I went through the period of time Philip remembers from his past life when there were stockbrokers or traders on the phone trading securities. They were doing it manually, and inside of a decade, it was completely solved by electronic trading. So I was like, well, that's going to be what happens to recruiters, but it didn't. And so I think it will be easier for companies to do it themselves and identify and then acquire and make those connections. I'm not sure how, but I'm pretty sure it's going to be through AI tools so that the people you want to reach will actually listen to you and will connect with you, and you can pursue and try to recruit them without an intermediary. And so what that will do for my industry is what's happened already. It's just continually moving us up the value chain where we're filling jobs that are much more critical to the company and they are worth the cost, and we're definitely providing value. So I think that's where it will go. And I think that technology will also enhance the gig economy, which will make it easier for you to hire people who will help you for a gig and solve your talent problem that way.
I'm going to chime in really quick on just a more of a smaller scale and more Montana specific. From where Alan sits and the global client base and reach that they have, I agree with almost everything Alan is saying. I will say in for roles that are critical relationship roles, your leadership team, HR, your CFO, your controller, those that are communicating and the inner workings, working interdepartmentally, interrelationally, I think AI is going to do what LinkedIn did, but just take it 100x in terms of being able to identify who does what, right? What's the job they have? Where do they work? Compensation, you know, where do they reside? How much flexibility do they have? But I actually think AI will do what LinkedIn did in different ways, where it just becomes noise, right? Like think about when LinkedIn came on the scene and you were getting these cool messages from people you'd never talked to. And all of a sudden you've got access to a global Rolodex, right? There was a time where it actually was really cool and you could connect and relate with people you did not know. But now it's just chatter, right? And you don't have the bandwidth, right? We only have so many hours in the day where to get back to those level of responses, candidates are getting hammered. Candidates are absolutely being inundated every day, where people have abandoned the phones, people have abandoned in-person meetings. Days of old, we used to recruit candidates over coffee, over lunch, spousal dinners. I mean, it used to be a very hands-on relationship piece. We still believe in that, by the way, especially in a smaller economy and smaller scale. I think knowing who you want is one thing. Connecting with them, relating to them, being in person, being in relationship, being in their physical space will be a requirement to move talent. Now, I'm not talking about a fulfillment center that's got to bring in 1,000 workers for busy, you know, for a 3-month project to literally get production out the door and get it boxed and onto UPS. I'm talking about the real critical relationships within your organization. So at MSU, I bring in speakers all the time to my class and really try to pick speakers who are owners, who are trendsetters, and who want to know the talent in their backyard in that 20-something, 30-something. And then I just let them tell their story. And then students absolutely gravitate to that because of what Alan said in terms of people want to work for people who can share a vision, where there's purpose, where there's a reason to get out of bed in the morning. If you intersect yourself with the talent you really want relationally, that's where you'll win the talent game. But you're going to have to put yourself into relationship with them. And that means a lot of time, right? So historically, HR has done that for us. Recruiting, internal recruiting has done that for us. External recruiting has done that. And you're going to need all those mechanisms or some form of mechanism. But the more you intersect relationally, the more you'll win at the talent game.
Yeah.
Alan,
Okay.
disagree with
Sorry
that,
to
Alan?
just keep us moving. I know there's a lot to go from there. Thanks, Julie. I appreciate the more local perspective. But I do want to get back to questions for the audience. Derek, I know you were up next. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hey guys, how are you? I'm coming from Arizona. I found this Montana scaling from Philip's LinkedIn page. Thought it was pretty interesting. I'm not sure if I'm speaking loud enough, but Alan, thank you so much for the give me a second. Let me do this audio video situation. I'm in my car, so like my video isn't that good, but yeah. So I was just really happy to make this call because it's actually very relevant to what I'm brainstorming. I have a startup that I'm looking to launch directly into the whole talent situation and really looking at the labor market as a whole. But not really looking towards scaling a large corporation, but looking at that exit route, whether it's acquisition. So just want to really get to learn more about what are some of the parameters that companies like Adecco really focus on when they look at acquiring startups that are directly in that talent recruiting space.
Okay, yeah, I think as you're in the car, so the audio is difficult. I think what you're asking is, what do large companies, let's call it in the staffing world, or in the human resource consulting world, look for if they're going to go buy a smaller company in that space? Is that what you're asking?
Yes, essentially, like, yeah, the acquisition to diligence, how many years, like, yeah, just trying to like sort of get some of the early signals that are relevant for acquisition. Because the reason I'm asking is going directly to where I'm building a few. I'm building a startup called Iceberg, and we are targeting is a hiring process problem. And it's really going towards what this conversation has been about. So my purpose for joining this call was to really look at, I think, picking anybody's brains here that can really look at some of the priorities that exiting from a large corporation's viewpoint.
Well, I mean, the most important thing, and again, I hope I'm answering the question. The most important thing among many equally important, so maybe it's not the most, it's one of the most, is scale. Big companies, it's just as much work to buy a company that's doing 400 million in revenue as a company that's doing 10 million in revenue. And if you're a company that's 3 billion in revenue, buying a company that's 20 million in revenue is not necessarily going to move the needle. So one of the things you have to think about is how big is your company going to scale to, and what scale is going to be commensurately attractive to the buyer. So a smaller buyer is going to be more attracted to a company doing 20 million than a $3 billion company is going to be attracted to a company doing 20 million. So you have to be big enough to be worth their time and energy to go buy to begin with, or you have to be differentiated. You have to be in a space that they're not in, or that they're getting into, and you will help them grow that by adding that new expertise that their company is not deeply steeped in. So you either have to have enough size for it to move the needle in buying you, or you have to be doing something cool, or even something not so cool, but not a business that they're currently in that they want to get into. So if it's a company that's, let's say, in permanent staffing, and they want to get into interim staffing, and you are an interim staffing company, and you're not very big, they may be a little more likely to buy you than if you're in the permanent staffing business where that's their core. And so scale is number one. You got to be big enough. I guess you can also be one in a million that has secret sauce, some intellectual property that's brilliant that they'll pay for, even if you're a tiny company, because that IP is worth a lot and they can scale it. Does that help? Does that answer the question?
Yes, very much so. I made a lot of things clear. But I mean, like, moving away from a generic Google search to like a more understanding what some of these companies think about. So yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
And if you have target companies that are big that you like, that are public, go in and look at their proxy statement, listen to their earnings calls. You'll learn a lot about how they're growing the company and what they are focused on it, and that'll tell you whether they're a potential buyer of your company.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
You're right. I think I was selected for the last
Sorry, we have
question.
time for one more question. I think I'm gonna, yeah, sorry about that. John, can you ask the last question? Make it quick.
Yep, very quick. So first, thank you both. So we talked about culture, talked about remote workers. How in a startup environment where some of your key people may be remote, can a startup CEO build that culture? Are there any best practices or insights you can share?
Julie, is that you or me?
That's you.
I was afraid of that. John, I wish I could tell you. I wish I could tell you. I was just on Squawk Box yesterday, and I talked about the aftershock of the Great Resignation, which is what we're in right now, which is the great stuck employee. They want to move, but they can't. That's quite different than 2002. We're still figuring out remote work. And so honestly, I don't know the answer. What I do know is distance does not foster connectivity. doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that. So I think it's basically over communicating. That's really the only way to fill the void or the chasm between the physical presence of the employee in the office or not. The other is probably, I've said this to bigger companies, look, you're saving a ton of money on real estate. You used to spend 100 million a year on rent in 10 places around the world. You now spend less. Don't just take the difference and put it to the bottom line. Take a few million of it and bring your employees together at company meetings. Do a 2-day event in Vegas or Bozeman or wherever. So bringing people together that don't work together every day in a good social setting, although expensive, is probably worth it, depending upon how big your company is. And of course, a lot of this Zoom stuff, although by the way, Zoom can be very fatiguing. We all know that, or Teams or whatever. So no one's figured it out. We all know distance is not great for connectivity, and bad connectivity is very much not good for culture. So I think you just have to experiment, and but clearly communicating more often is a good way to treat it.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a tough problem.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Alan. Fantastic. Julie, terrific. Thank you so much. This has been really enlightening session. And thanks again to everyone who participated today, and to all of you who will watch this later on recording. Thank you for doing that as well. Great to see everybody. Take care. Talk soon.